Good afternoon. We'll begin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Subcommittee meeting will come to order. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. Sorry for the delay. This pesky constitutional requirement of voting always gets in the way. But I'd like to welcome Federal Communications Commission Chairman Ajit Pai and Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel. The toughest challenge of the day having been completed. I am glad to have multiple commissioners here again, unlike recent years, because this is always an interesting and impactful hearing. The FCC oversees a sixth of the U.S. economy, and its work touches our lives every day. An FCC decision paved the way every time we look something up on a smartphone, send a text message, or use Wi-Fi. In fact, for better or worse, the FCC is one of those rare agencies that has become a household name. First, the better. The FCC's work is key to winning the race for 5G, which is essential for our economy and national security. The U.S. led the world in 4G because of the winning playbook that Congress and the FCC developed, of opening up new spectrum bands and letting companies innovate. Former Chairman Wheeler started us down the path in 5G with the Spectrum Frontiers proceeding, which aims to get huge amounts of high-frequency spectrum onto the market. Chairman Pai, I know you and Chairman Wheeler didn't always see eye to eye on many things, but I'm glad to see you continuing the important work he started with Frontiers. We also appreciate the progress the Commission has made on bipartisan basis on wireless issues, whether by exploring new unlicensed options or potentially repurposing mid-band airwaves for 5G. And you know from previous hearings that I had serious concerns about the proposed merger of Sinclair and Tribune, so I was glad to see the FCC took the action it did. Now for the worse. Unfortunately, the Commission continues to advance policies that tend to favor large industry players at the expense of consumers and small businesses. We saw it with the innovation ban. There, the FCC replaced a unique licensing scheme carefully crafted to foster innovation and experimentation with a more traditional system favored by big wireless carriers. I'm also concerned the Commission is moving too quickly to auction spectrum in the 24 gigahertz band. Agencies have raised significant concerns about the potential impact to weather radars essential to public safety and national security. I'm disturbed to see the FCC take such a heavy-handed approach on cell tower siting by preempting the ability of state and local officials to make decisions in the best interest of their communities. But nowhere was this more apparent when the Commission decided as one of the first actions under the Chairman to undo the 2015 net neutrality order. That was wrong both on the law and policy. It hurt small businesses and consumers. Poll after poll shows overwhelming public support for net neutrality. And I continue to be concerned with the process the FCC followed to get there. The net neutrality proceeding has been the subject of numerous controversies and investigations, some of which are still ongoing. Just a couple weeks ago, the FCC agreed to pay over $43,000 in attorney's fees over a FOIA request on fraudulent comments. And the agency's own IG found the chairman made an inaccurate statement about a denial of service attack. Yet the Commission still managed to plow ahead in just 7 months. This is a distressing pattern. Time and again, the Commission has fast-tracked proposals favored by industry while important consumer issues remain in limbo. It took just 3 months after the chairman took over to reinstate the UHF discount, paving the way for more consolidation in the broadcasting market. And the Commission deemed most of the business broadband market competitive after 3 months as well. That's roughly $550 billion part of the economy. Yet the FCC has not yet adopted a long-term broadband funding plan for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands that was proposed last May. Nor has the FCC clarified what rules apply to the sale of phone tracking data, even after multiple stories about how easy it is to buy this information. The FCC hasn't finalized a proposal after a year to prohibit the use of broadband subsidies to do business with companies that might post a national security risk. And robocalls have reached crisis levels. Yet the FCC is relying on industry to figure out a system for authenticating calls rather than issuing strong rules with firm deadlines. The FCC is reviewing 2 major mergers now. The Sprint T-Mobile deal could harm working families and minorities that rely on these companies for affordable care, cell service. And Next Star Tribune is another broadcast merger that once again could hurt media diversity and choice. The Commission's actions to date raise serious concerns about whether the Commission will put consumers ahead of corporations on these and other issues. Getting this right couldn't be more important. These issues touch every aspect of our lives. They could undermine the benefits of broadband and hinder our competitiveness in 5G. I look forward to discussing in more detail how the Commission can best use its resources. Before I turn to the witnesses, I would recognize that playing the role of ranking member today for now is Mr. Amade, who has informed me that there are no opening remarks. Is that correct, sir?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for acknowledging that, and I yield back.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I would now like to recognize Chairman Pai for his testimony. Sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Amade, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to present the FCC's fiscal year 20 budget request. Our OMB designated spending level for fiscal year 20 is $335,660,000, derived from regulatory fees for regular FCC operations and an auction spending cap of $132,538,680. But first, I'd like to thank you for providing us with generous funding in the omnibus, as well as permission to complete internal reorganizations to advance agency reform efforts. The additional auction funds are allowing us to implement Congress's expansion of the TV Broadcaster Relocation Fund to reimburse low-power television, TV translator, and FM radio stations for costs related to the post-incentive auction spectrum repack. We've also been able to establish a dedicated call center and launch a public education campaign to assist consumers who are affected by the relocation of broadcast stations. And we greatly appreciate your authorization to create the Office of Economics and Analytics. As a result, we are making great strides expanding and deepening the use of economic analysis in our decision-making. Our budget proposal for next year for regular operations is slightly below what we received for fiscal year 19, and our auction cap is only adjusted upward for inflation. So we will maintain our FTE level. And those 1,448 FTEs during the next fiscal year will be focusing on 4 important priorities. First, we will continue to implement our 5G FAST plan so that the U.S. continues to lead the world in the next generation of wireless connectivity. Our plan has 3 components, 2 of which are infrastructure deployment and regulatory modernization. But this afternoon, I'd like to focus on the third, the critical task of pushing more spectrum into the commercial marketplace. Our 28 gigahertz auction concluded last month and yielded about $702 million in gross bids for the U.S. Treasury. Our 24 gigahertz auction is underway and so far has more than doubled that amount. But more importantly, we're making essential spectrum available for 5G, and we'll keep it up. Later this year, we will hold a single auction of the upper 37, 39, and 47 gigahertz bands. Next year, we'll auction mid-band spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band. Now, these auctions will free up over 5 gigahertz of spectrum for commercial use. Now, for perspective, that is more spectrum than is currently used for mobile broadband by all mobile providers in the United States combined. Second, we'll continue our work to close the digital divide. Because of the groundbreaking Connect America Fund Phase 2 reverse auction, we're awarding about $1.5 billion to over 713,000 homes and businesses nationwide. This represents $3.5 billion in savings from the $5 billion price we initially thought would be required to connect these unserved areas. Moreover, 99.7% of the winning bids will provide consumers with service of at least 25 megabits per second. We've also increased funding to provide connectivity to rural healthcare institutions, and soon we will offer many small rural carriers the opportunity to opt into model-based universal service support, tying greater funding to greater accountability and increased deployment of high-speed broadband. We also expect to move forward with additional funding for broadband deployment in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, and to complete a proceeding to ease the deployment of fiber for schools and libraries participating in our E-rate program. Third, we'll continue our work to protect public safety. Last year, we strengthened wireless emergency alerts, which play a critical role in notifying Americans when disaster strikes. We proposed rules to implement Carey's Law. That law requires multi-line telephone systems, which commonly serve office buildings and hotels, to let people dial 911 directly. and it requires the notification of building staff in order to get first responders inside ASAP. And just last month, we proposed rules to improve our ability to locate wireless 911 callers in multi-story buildings. In a multi-story building, emergency personnel need to know a caller's vertical location in order to provide assistance. Our 911 location accuracy proposal aims to supply that information. And in the year to come, we plan to adopt final rules here. Fourth and finally, we'll continue to highlight the importance of a diverse communications sector. For example, after over 2 decades of debate, the FCC last year adopted a broadcast incubator program to encourage employment and ownership for underrepresented communities. We continue to rely on our Advisory Committee for Diversity, which is focusing, among other things, on the lack of representation in Silicon Valley. And we established supplier diversity conferences to ensure that capital and expertise are matched with talent and ambition. Let me conclude by thanking the FCC's terrific career staff for their work advancing the public interest, and thank this committee for the work they do to provide us the resources necessary to discharge that responsibility. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner Rosenwasser, I had it.
Good afternoon, Chairman Quigley, Ranking Member Amidai, and the members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear here today. As you heard from the start, communications technologies power about 1/6 of our nation's economy, and every American needs access to these technologies to have a fair shot at 21st century success. And that's why the work of the FCC matters. It's also why the budget request from the administration that is before you is so striking. It asks for less than the $339 million the agency is set to spend in the current fiscal year, and it is about $4 million less than the budget level authorized by Congress. If adopted, it would result in the smallest payroll in decades, at a time when communications technologies loom larger than ever before in all of our lives. So many people think that Washington is rigged against them. It saddens me that with this budget and with the actions of the FCC during the past 2 years, it appears they are right. That is because too often the FCC has acted at the behest of the corporate forces that surround it, shortchanging the American people and undermining our digital future. This is a problem that requires resources to fix. Plus, Congress entrusted the FCC with significant new work in the Ray-Baums Act. We have mergers to review, spectrum auctions to hold, and a tremendous increase in equipment authorizations to oversee with the growth of 5G wireless and the Internet of Things. On top of this, we have a digital divide in this country we sorely need to address. I believe budgets are not just about accounting. They are a statement of values. And I believe the 4 basic values in communications laws, consumer protection, universal service, competition, and public safety, need refocus and attention. First, consumer protection. Consumer protection requires the FCC to be nimble, because the communications industry changes at a breakneck pace. But our efforts to stem the growing tide of robocalls have been anything but. At the start of this administration, American consumers received roughly 2 billion robocalls a month. That number now exceeds 5 billion a month. That's crazy. The FCC has responded with a series of fines for bad actors responsible for robocalls. But according to the Wall Street Journal last week, the agency has collected no more than a grand total of $6,790 in fines. That's insane. It's clear the agency's current approach is not working. It's like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. We don't have time for that. So let me propose 3 things. First, it's time for the agency to require in its rules call authentication technology. Second, I've written the major carriers calling for them to make free tools to avoid robocalls available to every consumer. I think it's time for my colleagues to join me in this quest. Third, it's time for the agency to create a new division to focus on robocalls. Robocalls are the largest single source of consumer complaints at this agency. It's time for the FCC to organize its work to reflect that. The second value is universal service. And as I said at the outset, no matter who you are or where you live in this country, you're going to need access to modern communications to have a fair shot at 21st century success. But the fact of the matter is that today millions and millions of Americans lack access to broadband. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the FCC does not know exactly where they are. That's unacceptable. The way to fix this mess is to develop honest and accurate broadband and wireless maps that detail where service is and is not in every community in this country. After all, we will never manage problems that we do not measure. The third value is competition. Of course, it yields lower prices and higher quality services, but today, too few American consumers have any competitive choice for broadband service. And that's one of the reasons why, in 2015, the FCC adopted net neutrality rules. With net neutrality in place, your broadband provider does not have the right to block websites, throttle online services, or censor online content. And that sounds good to me. In fact, it sounds good to most of the American public because a study from the University of Maryland found that 86% of the public supports net neutrality. But over my objection and theirs, the agency rolled back its net neutrality rules in 2017. A few weeks ago, I was the only FCC commissioner to sit through the oral argument at court reviewing the FCC decision to eradicate net neutrality. What's obvious to me is that some part of our decision, if not all of it, will be remanded. When that happens, I don't think the agency should be allowed to waste another dime of taxpayer money to sustain its flawed rollback with additional appeals to the courts. Finally, the fourth value is public safety. And to this end, I believe the FCC needs to update our policies to reflect new cybersecurity challenges, modernize emergency alerting, and improve location accuracy with 911. And I worry that our current budget is not substantial enough to allow for those things. Now, in closing, I want to make a quick note about 911 operators and offer my support for Congresswoman Torres's bipartisan work to give 911 operators the regulatory classification they deserve. Right now, the Office of Management and Budget classifies them as clerical workers, and it does not reflect the public safety duties they have taken on. In closing, thank you, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. It's as if we had this planned. I'm going to let Ms. Torres go first because she has to go to the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your patience, Mr. Chairman. I do appreciate going first. And Commissioner Rosenworcel, thank you so much for visiting the 911 Center where I spent 17 and a half years of my life working as a 911 dispatcher. Commissioner Pai, I invite you to come and trust me, you'll have a great time with these ladies learning about the work that they do every single day. 911 Saves Act, I think, is a critical step in the right direction at ensuring that when we continue to send more work, more critical work to these 911 dispatchers, text to 911, video to 911, having to deal with, I would call it, unimproved location accuracy. We are demanding so much of them. Certainly they deserve to be classified as anything other than taxi cab dispatchers. That is offensive to the nature of the work that they're doing every single day. And I hope to get your support on this bill, and thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel, for being one of the first champions to champion this issue for 911 dispatchers. Improved 911 location accuracy. Let me speak a little bit around that with my experience. Unregistered phones are a hazard. They're an incredible hazard. For children, we teach our kids to dial 911 whenever they come across danger, and they do. At my 911 center, we had a call. I did not take that call, but one of my colleagues did. We think it was a 5-year-old boy. We think it was his mother. All we could do is listen to the assault in progress. He was taught to dial 911 when he needed help. Unfortunately, his cell phone had ran out of minutes. Because his cell phone ran out of minutes, there was no mandate for that phone company to provide the accurate location information from where that victim was calling from. So we sat there and we listened to him cry, scream, while he was being kicked, while he was being slapped, while he was being cursed at. To this day, I don't know what happened to that child, but I will live with that forever. it's a failure of the system like that, where we teach our children, we teach our population to call 911, and when they do, we're not able to help them. I think 911 dispatchers are critical to the first responder communities. Without them answering the phone, you can't get a police officer, a paramedic, or a fire truck to the scene. So we have to do more to ensure that we are empowering these individuals with the proper training that they need. The attrition rate for this group of people is horrific. It used to be 70% at my 911 center until we improved training and conditions, working conditions for them. I would like for you to talk about where you see ensuring that 911 surcharges that are collected at the state level are truly being utilized, not as a paycheck or as a personal checkbook, to phone companies, but the delivery of a 911 call does not stop at the door of the 911 center. It actually does not stop until you get the emergency personnel to the location where it's needed. Would you comment on that, please?
Thank you for your comments, Congresswoman, and for your leadership on these public safety issues. I could not agree with you more. Having visited public safety answering points in big cities like New Orleans and New York, and in small towns like rural West Virginia, where a two-woman PSAP literally was the only thing keeping a community together when floods were ravaging that center. It is heroic work. And I think often about Terrell Morris, who was the head of the New Orleans 911 call center, who told me the story about a dispatcher who was handling a call that somebody had been shot in a particular neighborhood. She had to continue handling the call professionally once she realized her brother was the one who had been shot and killed. Just think about the things
unusual.
It's a very common story, and so I'm very sensitive to the fact that a lot of these dispatchers work longer shifts. Often the times the shifts go from 8 hours to 12 hours to cover shortages. Right. Many times it's very stressful as it is. There are no avenues for them to get some of the help they need. The training is very difficult. You have to be trained across a variety of areas. In addition to that, as you pointed out, the classification for these workers is not necessarily where it needs to be. And so I stand foursquare behind you on making sure that we heighten the importance of preserving this public safety system that we've got, including recognizing the tremendous value that dispatchers bring to the table.
Thank you. I yield back. Please join me in my district and tour one of my centers.
I would love to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Amade.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to Mr. Stewart, who has requested it.
No.
Mr. Chairman, I rescind that and yield my time back to the committee to make up for my lateness, which I should be just about back to even by now, huh?
In the interest of going back and forth, Ms. Stewart.
Thank you. Thank you to my friend, Mr. Amade, and to the chairman for holding, and to both of you for being here. Commissioner, it's good to see you. Chairman, thank you again to both of you. You can guess what I'm going to ask about. The suicide prevention hotline number that you and the people that work with you have been so helpful working with us on that. We're grateful for that. So a couple questions. When will the final report be delivered to Congress? As you know, the legislation required for you to deliver us a report will include a number recommendation, and of course, I'm hoping that it's 611 and that we don't have to share a number at least. And then will you, the FCC, move unilaterally to declare that number? And sir, if you would answer those questions, and I'd like to follow up, if I could, with one other concern.
Thank you, Congressman Stewart. I appreciate the hospitality you and former Senator Hatch gave me to talk about the importance of this issue, and it's something I recognize the importance of as well. In terms of timing, we will meet the statutory deadline of getting that report out. We've been working with our public safety staff to make sure that we do. In terms of a number, we've been working with various stakeholders, taking meetings and the like on the wisdom of this particular number versus another. We haven't made a determination on that front because we're still taking meetings. And in terms of moving unilaterally, there might be some concerns there. We would like to work through with you if you and your staff would like to do so. But we recognize the importance of this legislation and are on track to implement the directives that you've given to the FCC.
Well, we appreciate that. I mean, look, it's dramatic to say, and we hear it often, this legislation will save lives, or in some cases, the lack of this legislation will cost lives. But this literally is true. I mean, this idea that you can have this universal national, three-digit number for suicide prevention is such a necessary thing. And if I were to ask people in this room, in a moment of honest and being candid, how many of us have been impacted, either in our family or people that we love, people close to us, by suicide or attempted suicide? It would be a startling number. It's many of us. And this is a very helpful thing for that. And again, I would like to thank you and the rest of the commission for working with us on that. Now, a concern that we have, not only the number and not sharing the number, is this similar to what has been raised here, the geolocation. And that is that, if I called the suicide prevention hotline number on my phone here, it would be routed to Utah and provide me a resource in Utah. Have you looked at that and considered the importance of geolocation like they do with the regular 911 call? And can we have that important option on this as well?
Absolutely, Congressman. We've taken a number of initiatives in terms of geolocation, making sure that the call actually tracks back to where you are as opposed to where someone in a 911 call center might think you are. That disjunction can be the difference between life and death in many cases. And so we are working on a number of different fronts. For example, we have an initiative to make sure that when your cell phone, if you're calling from one state and your cell phone pings a tower in an adjoining state, we're working to make sure that that 911 call is properly routed to the PSAP to which you are, that is closest to you, that effectively can handle your issue. In addition to that, in terms of things like wireless emergency alerts and the like, we're moving to more granularity so that you can get the information that is necessary for you in an emergency in a way that you can't currently. And so a variety of different things we're doing on that front, but the key is to make sure that we can actually help our 911 call center takers figure out where you are more quickly.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. So then I'm going to ask, just simply, would it be our expectation, would it be fair to expect that when we implement this three-digit National Suicide Prevention Hotline number, that we would have geolocation attached to that and we would know where that person was actually located?
That is certainly a goal that we share, and so we look forward to working with you to see if that goal can be incorporated into.
Okay, so it sounds like it may be a hope, it's a goal, but it's not necessarily a conclusion yet. Is that true?
There's some issues of technical feasibility that we would like to work through and work through with you if that's possible.
We look forward to working with you on that, because as you have expressed already, it would be important to do so. And let me just not necessarily ask a question, but just maybe make a point in the few seconds I have remaining. You have worked with us, and we appreciate your prioritizing the low-power TV translators with some additional funding that we gave you last year. I come from a very mountainous region. I actually have more transmitters in my district than any other place in the country, and by not a small number. Hundreds and hundreds of transmitters in Utah, and these are rural areas, and frankly, most of them rely on local television for their news and information and weather and other things. So I guess my question to you just very briefly is there sufficient funding, do you think, for us to assist the lower power translator stations as they go through this transition?
I do believe there is, Congressman. I want to thank you, the entire Congress, for providing that funding, because that was a gap in the original funding stream that would have left a lot of your folks out in the cold, essentially. And so we're moving aggressively to use that funding to benefit some of those low-power translator and FM radio stations that otherwise wouldn't have been protected. And I've met with a variety of Utah broadcasters, and we've developed decisions in order to make sure that they are kept whole.
And you think we're okay on that funding then?
I do, but if that changes, we will make sure we contact you.
Let us know. We want to assist in that. And to Mr. Amadei, thank you, sir, and Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. I think fortuitous that I follow you in this regard, because it's important to win the race to 5G, but it's just as important as an economic issue. It's crucial to our national security, but as members of the Intelligence Committee, the news about potential vulnerabilities from Chinese equipment is extremely concerning. So it's important to win, but more important to win the right way by making sure our networks are secure and resilient. First, Commissioner Rosenworcel, you've mentioned that the FCC should update its policies to reflect new cybersecurity challenges. Do you think the FCC is doing enough to address these security issues, and what else should we be doing?
Thank you for the question. Cybersecurity has never been more important. We are looking at a future with billions of devices with the Internet of Things that can trace and track us wherever we go. We have got to make sure FCC policies are wholly up to date. We face challenges with equipment supply chain. We face challenges with spectrum security, and we're going to have to figure out how to update our policies. But if I had to identify three things I'd like us to do most, the first is I'd like us to reinstate the Communications Security, Interoperability, and Reliability Committee and make it focus on 5G security. I think we have challenges with supply chain dynamics, and we have to figure out how to use our resources to fix that. In addition, the Department of Homeland Security has an interagency advisory committee on the security of next-generation networks. The FCC is not present at the table in that discussion. I think that's an oversight, and as the nation's regulator that oversees communications networks, we should fix it. And finally, the FCC's equipment authorization process reviews millions and millions of devices every year. We should figure out how to standardize a certification in that process that ensures that all sorts of equipment going forward that require software updates will get them regularly, because that will increase all of our security.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, a year ago, the FCC proposed to ban the use of Universal Service Fund subsidies to purchase equipment from certain companies for national security reasons. Addressing those potential vulnerabilities in our communication supply chain is essential to ensuring the 5G networks aren't turned into a weapon against the American people. Can you explain where that proposal is at this time?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. We have made that proposal. We have developed a record. We are working with the National Telecommunications and Information Association, a component of the Commerce Department, as you know, to finalize what that proposal will look like in terms of the agencies responsible for determining which entities might present a security threat in terms of our ICT networks. And so we hope to move forward quickly, but we share the sense of priority that you attach to this issue, and I hear about it every day, and I discuss it with some of my counterparts around the world whenever I have a chance.
And let's dig into that. You've been working with other agencies to press the case with our allies, and as you just described, talking to our allies. Can you talk a little bit more about how that is working, the reaction you're getting?
In terms of the interagency cooperation, it is extremely strong. We've worked very well with our State Department, for example, Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and others to make sure that we are all on the same page, and we are, about the need to recognize the importance of security in our own ICT networks. Going abroad as well, I've had many discussions with other countries, and while I'm not at liberty to discuss exactly what is said in those meetings, what I can tell you is that our counterparts in other countries do recognize the importance of preserving the security of their own networks and having a framework to evaluate the risk profile of equipment and services that is incorporated into 5G networks. Unlike 4G networks, one of the things that is unique about 5G is, number one, that in terms of the technical standards that are being set, security is being incorporated at the get-go as opposed to 4G when it was more of an afterthought. And secondly, they recognize that to the extent that you lock yourself in, so to speak, with respect to particular infrastructure, that there may be longer-term risks that have to be addressed. And so I think those conversations are going very well, and ultimately we stand united on this issue about the need to preserve the security of these networks here and abroad.
Thank you. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, and let me welcome both of our witnesses today. Let me address this first to Ms. Rosenworcel, then to Chairman Pai. You can both comment on this. As you are likely aware, T-Mobile and Sprint announced a potential merger on April 29th, 2018, which is currently undergoing a review process at the Justice Department and the FCC. The day after the merger was announced, 9 T-Mobile executives checked into the Trump Hotel located in the government-owned old post office building here in D.C. And since then, nearly $200,000 has gone from the coffers of this international telecommunications company to an organization run by and benefiting the president and his family. Reports indicate that T-Mobile's CEO took pains to make his presence known, that he milled around in the lobby of the building taking pictures in a conspicuously branded outfit, met with multiple persons associated with the Trump campaign, and deleted several old tweets criticizing the Trump Hotel from 2015. Especially in light of the president's personal intervention into the previous merger proceedings, I'm very concerned about the conflict of interest, or even simply the appearance of a conflict of interest that such a business relationship creates. Is this the way that our country should be conducting its antitrust policy? Would you please respond to that, both of you, yes or no, and then would you comment on it?
Without getting to the merits of the underlying transaction, which is presently before us, I will say that that does not look good. And it leaves me concerned that this is the way that mergers are taking place in this country today.
Mr. Powell?
Congressman, my decision on this transaction, as with any transaction that is presented to the Federal Communication Commission, will be driven by two things and two things only: the facts and the law. Nothing more, nothing less.
Okay. Prison phone calls. In recent years, the FCC has opposed and backed away from implementing rate caps in intrastate prison calls, which is essential for the rehab of inmates by allowing them to feel connected to their families and their communities. Can you explain to me why the FCC refuses to mitigate the predatory practices of companies that are charging excessive rates to inmates?
Thank you for the question, Congressman.
It's my understanding that the FCC did have a rule in place that had some regulation on that.
That is correct, Congressman.
And
unfortunately,
let me direct it to Ms. Rosen Warsaw first, and then to you.
Okay.
There are 2.7 million children in this country who have a parent in prison. Regular contact with family and kin is not just good for them, it helps all of us because it reduces recidivism. But most prisoners and their families pay as much for a single call as everyone in this room pays for a monthly unlimited plan. That's not right. We need to fix it. And the FCC over the last several years has made several efforts to do so. With intrastate rates, interstate rates, ancillary fees, site commissions, our work has been remanded to us. And it is distressing that the agency refuses to continue to work on this problem because rates just keep going up, and it's unfair, and it's not right.
Now, Chairman Powell.
Congressman, my position on this issue is pretty simple. We need to do everything within our authority to address this problem. I was the first to point out many years ago, almost 5 years ago, 6 years ago rather, that there was a solution in terms of rate caps for interstate fees as well as ancillary fees that would have survived judicial review. Unfortunately, the previous FCC disregarded my recommendation, and the results.
Interstate or intrastate?
Interstate. Under the law, as the D.C. Circuit unfortunately held, as you pointed out, we do not have authority over intrastate fees. That's part of the reason why I've consistently said, let's attack the problem to the extent that the D.C. Circuit has said we could. Moreover, number two, I'd bring to your attention the fact that recently, as a result of the FCC staff's very careful review of a potential transaction between two of the major players in the inmate calling services field, and they made a recommendation to me, and I agreed with that recommendation to disapprove that transaction specifically because it would present competitive concerns in terms of the potential price increases. So this is an issue that we are very sensitive to, and those parties recently dismissed their application to merge. So this is an indication of the fact that we look forward to working with you on this problem, to solving the statutory gaps identified by the D.C. Circuit, and to doing the other things necessary to address an issue that we agree has gone on for far too long.
Rebuttal?
I appreciate that the chairman acknowledged that in an effort to combine two of the largest prison payphone providers, the agency decided to say no. He's right about that. But what I don't believe he's correct about is that we lack any authority going forward. We can do work on site commissions, on ancillary fees. We can continue to look to structure incentives for intrastate rates. We can do better than just allow the existing system to continue because it is charging prisoners and their families absolutely usurious rates. It's not fair and it is not right, and we should be looking for every way we can to fix this problem.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Ms. Kirkpatrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, witnesses, for being here today. And thank you, Commissioner Rosenworcel, for the opportunity to talk with you yesterday. We need quality coverage data to ensure that we're spending federal funds for broadband wisely, but companies have financial incentives that could influence the data provided. What can the Commission do now to improve the quality of data collection? Would you support the use of other data or measurements to help validate and improve the information the Commission collects?
Thank you for the question. We need to have better broadband maps. I don't care where you live in this country, we should know if you have service or if you don't have service. Because if we don't know that fact, we will take scarce federal dollars and we may not necessarily direct them to the right places. But right now with the FCC's maps, I mean, listen, there was a cabinet official who just last month testifying before the House called them fake news. That's a loaded term, but there's truth in this. Our maps don't honestly reflect where service is and is not. So we are going to have to stop acting like we can do this all in Washington. We need to start figuring out how crowdsourcing can be a part of this, how the FCC's field offices can do spot checks, how we can work with universities, how we can work with postal authorities, anyone who traverses rural areas to help us identify where service is and is not. Because if we know that with precision, we can start targeting our funds with precision and fixing this problem.
I want to ask a question about the proposed Usf Cap, again for Commissioner Rosenworcel. Do you think the FCC can make sufficient progress on addressing broadband access if it caps the overall USF budget?
The answer is no. We should be doing three things. First, we should be figuring out where service is and is not in this country. Second, we should come to Congress with a price of serving all of those areas that do not presently have broadband and wireless service. And third, then we need to develop a plan. We're doing this backwards if we're capping ourselves before we even start the process.
I agree with you. Thank you very much. Commissioner Pai, I have a question for you. You've said that addressing the digital divide is one of the most important priorities for the Commission under your leadership. How is this proposal consistent with that statement?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. Each one of the 4 component programs within the Universal Service Fund currently has a cap or a budget. And so it is reasonable then to think about the issue of whether there should be a cap for the overall Universal Service Fund. The proposal on the table involves a cap that is significantly above the current disbursements for the Universal Service Fund. And in addition, this is an issue that was very important to one of my colleagues. And so we wanted to tee up the idea, should we have this conversation about what the overall cap should be? That is in part in a way to ensure that there's public confidence that every single dollar spent through the Universal Service Fund is going to be spent wisely, that there's a measure of fiscal responsibility that people can know when they're paying into the fund. There's a cop on the beat, the FCC, to make sure those funds go to closing the digital divide to places that I visited that are on the wrong side, like Navajo Nation. If you drive from Phoenix to Flagstaff, you'll find many spots where you can't get that coverage. We want to change that.
A follow-up question on that. Under your proposal, how will the Commission determine what programs will not receive additional funding if the cap is reached?
That is one of the issues that is teed up in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, and I can assure you that we will not act on that proposal without soliciting public comment on it.
When do you expect that rulemaking to be finished?
Well, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking has not yet been approved, so I can't forecast how long that record would take to develop.
So we're years away from having that information in place.
I don't know about years, but what I can say is the NPRM has not yet been approved, and so we can't forecast what the record would be.
Commissioner Rosenworcel, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think one of the problems here is that Congress developed several programs for universal service. Programs to support service in rural areas, programs to support telemedicine, programs to support kids in schools getting internet, programs to support low-income households. And with a cap like this, we're going to make telemedicine providers fight with kids in schools for funding. I don't think that's right.
Thank you very much. My time's about to expire. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see each of you. Just a couple quick questions. First, on 5G, there's a lot of talk about that, and I know you've addressed it some. Maybe you've addressed a timeline before I came in, how you see that developing out. I think you've addressed some of the threats. What more can we be doing to assist? I understand you have a rule-making process going in place about maybe procurement and other things. But what are some other things we haven't asked about that we should be looking into? And Chairman Powell, I'll start with you, and maybe you can just bring us up to speed. I think we want to make sure we're providing the necessary resources and policy to sort of keep up with this.
Thank you for the question, Congressman, and I appreciate your interest, longstanding interest in these issues. I think one of the things that would be helpful would be to have additional congressional support for essentially repurposing spectrum that is not currently used for commercial purposes, and either allocating it for commercial purposes or at least allowing it to be shared with the commercial sector. One of the difficulties we've had has been trying to find out bands that are potentially useful for 5G, both low band, mid band, and high band, and then working with other industry stakeholders and other public sector agencies to repurpose it. The second thing, although it is not the first thing that people think about when they think about 5G, I actually think mostly about infrastructure, about getting those small cells up at scale, about getting the fiber in the ground that is necessary for us to be able to carry that 5G traffic back into the core of the network. And here, it would be terrific if Congress could speak with a unified voice about the need to streamline the process for regulatory approval. When we're competing against countries like China, which have a national priority on 5G infrastructure deployment, it is difficult for private sector entities here to say we have to jump through federal, state, local, and over 500 federally recognized tribes in order to get these 5G.
So resources are there,
right.
Infrastructure, in order to get it in place, just needs some regulatory easing.
Absolutely, and if I could make one quick pitch on fiber in terms of fiber deployment, one of the things that would be very helpful is filling the gap that currently exists in the FCC's authority. We have authority over the poles that are owned by utilities. We do not have jurisdiction over the poles that are owned by railroads or by municipal governments, and that is one of the biggest cost elements to building out a fiber network, especially if you're a smaller competitive provider. That gap would be terrific to see filled.
Great. Thank you. Would you like to respond to
Sure.
Please? Thank you.
I may surprise you, but I think my colleague actually did a really good job laying out those things, so I agree.
Let's have you in each response, too.
But I want to recommend one other thing. I think Congress should require that we have a spectrum calendar. So we identify to companies, manufacturers, bidders, when we are going to make airwaves available to market. Right now, we have a blitz of spectrum bands that are under consideration. We've got 2.5, 3.5, 3.7 to 4.2, 5.9, 4.9, 6. I mean, I can just keep on going on. It's like 10 to 30 of them that are under active consideration. We should put them on a calendar because the entire marketplace, the entire ecosystem would be more organized, and I think it would result in services getting to consumers faster.
So is there a timeline, a goal timeline, or is that what you're suggesting should be developed?
I am suggesting it should be required of this agency.
So there's no goal of 2021, 22, or 23 when it's...
I believe there are goals, but I think when Congress writes a law and we have to respond to it, we tend to actually abide by those obligations.
Okay, so you need a little motivation, sounds like. One last quick question. The New York Times today, you might have seen it, it was talking about the pay-to-track issue that's developed. You know, cyber and privacy are something that we've worked on a lot. I've worked on a lot, and as is the chairman here. But this indicates that there's a delay in response from the FCC, and as a result of that, that tracking is occurring by individuals who will pay for cellular data or geo positioning. Help us understand why there's a delay. It's been a year or so or more, or what are the challenges with this? And Chairman Pye, your chair.
Appreciate it, Congressman. I mean, the allegation of delay is flatly false. When we got word of this issue last year, I immediately instructed our staff to initiate an investigation. They've done that. I am hamstrung by the fact that I do not comment publicly on enforcement investigations, other than to say that the FCC's career staff is actively working on this issue within the relevant statute of limitations, and that's simply all I can say. I understand that it's an issue that has generated a lot of public interest, but I can tell you that our staff is working very hard on this issue, and I have to leave it at that.
I'm not totally satisfied with that. I think people need to know more. Everyone in this room has a wireless phone in their palm or their pocket or their purse, wherever they go. And it is disturbing to learn that wireless companies were selling that data to third parties who in turn would sell it to bail bondsmen and any other shady middlemen who could just purchase for a few $100s your location within a few hundred meters. I've asked the agency's enforcement bureau to explain to me just what we're doing. I've asked for letters of inquiry. They have refused to share with me information. This is an issue of national and personal security, and I think that the agency has to do more than just offer this quiet response.
So you mentioned cell phone, pockets, hands. Is it possible for an individual to turn off their privacy settings at any given time and their cell phone not be detected where they are?
No.
Is that something that the FCC should address, or is that possible?
The reality of owning a cell phone that's on is that as you walk around, it is regularly pinging a tower nearby in order to ensure that you have continuous service. Now, the FCC's customer proprietary network information rules are associated with that, and there are limits on what can be used if there's information gleaned from your location when you make a call. But we've got to update things for the Internet of Things, because we got, by the end of the decade, 50 billion wireless devices all around us that are all going to be conveying geolocation information. We're behind things. We need to start developing a plan, and we should be public about it.
So it's being abused by certain individual
The opportunities for abuse are substantial. We need to start figuring out how to develop better cyber hygiene and cybersecurity geolocation practices for every device and for everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Pai and Commissioner Rosenworcel for being here today. We appreciate your attendance. Commissioner Rosenworcel, as I know you know, night and day, Americans are being inundated by spam calls. It's more than an annoyance, it's an invasion of privacy, and is being used to deceive and take advantage of unsuspecting victims. In fact, experts predict that this year alone, nearly half of all calls will be spam. What is the FCC doing about this?
Thank you for the question. As I said in my opening statement, what's going on with robocalls is insane. At the start of this administration, there were 2 billion a month. It's now up to more than 5 billion a month. If you think that it's getting worse, it is. And while the FCC has tried to approach this with a few fixes and some bad actor fines, the Wall Street Journal last week said that we've collected less than $7,000 from bad actors and robocalls. We need to step up our game and make some changes. We need call authentication technologies that are required. I've written every major carrier and asked that they make free tools available to every consumer to block robocalls. I hope my colleagues will join me in that quest. And in addition, I think that it is necessary for us to reorganize the agency. As John Oliver recently said, 60% of FCC complaints are about robocalls. We should just have a division to help address those problems and go after this with vigor. I feel like the agency should be organized around the problems that consumers call in and tell us about.
What can Congress do to help you?
Congress, I believe the agency has adequate authority to require call authentication technologies tomorrow, but we've had an open rulemaking since 2017 on this subject, so were you to require it by a firm date, that would be helpful. I know you've done some work to try to suggest that we should have contests to come up with better robocalling technologies. I know the Federal Trade Commission had some a few years ago, and they produced positive results. I think you should compel us to reorganize our activity at the agency to have a division that is dedicated to fighting robocalls. We don't have that today, and we need it.
Did you say in response to my first question that the FCC only ushered in $7,000 of fines?
A little less than $7,000, according to the Wall Street Journal. We have assessed over $200 million since the start of this administration, but I do not believe we've actually collected on any of that.
What's wrong? Why isn't it being collected?
To be clear, the Department of Justice has these fines referred to them, and it's not that anyone sitting at this table, or my colleague included, don't want to see those individuals fined. But if we proceed with this approach at this pace, we are not going to solve the problem. We need to be far more aggressive, because what we're doing today is not good enough. The problem's growing rather than getting better.
So we have laws on the books. We have over $200 million of fines you've sent to the DOJ, and it's not being pursued.
It's very hard to collect against these bad actors. The bottom line is this theory of how to solve the problem is not working.
Right.
We need to be more aggressive and develop others.
Well, thank you. Chairman Pai, I know that the FCC has a lot on its plate between the rollout of 5G, addressing rural broadband, as well as spectrum auction. That is why my bill directs the FCC to lead other agencies in fighting the scourge of spam calls. Would you find it useful to have the input of agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, DHS, FBI, to name a few, in ending this plague?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I think that your bill, which I did have a chance to review, would set a useful marker in terms of establishing interagency coordination. This is one of the issues that we hear about all the time, that the Federal Trade Commission's do not call list has not been effective, and other agencies might have equities here. To get us all on the same page would be very useful. And my understanding is that legislation that was passed just today in the Senate would incorporate some of the core concepts in your bill. So hopefully this is not an abstract conversation, but something that could become a practical reality relatively soon.
Great, thank you, Chairman. And then finally, Commissioner Rosenworcel, it's come to my attention that the FCC received a deluge of comments on the net neutrality repeal, 22 million or so, is that correct?
That's correct. The problem is that work from the state attorneys general have identified that many of them were fraudulent. As many as 9.5 million involved stolen identities. In other words, they took the name and address of someone and just wrote to us with their false opinions. These things were filed in our public document. This is identity theft. We need to be taking it seriously because there's fraud that supported this outcome, and that's a problem. And I regret that the agency has just turned a blind eye to this identity theft, but I am relieved to know from press reports that the FBI is now looking into this, because this is the channel for public comment. This is how Americans tell Washington what they think of policies we're pursuing. And the FCC's net neutrality docket indicated that that channel is flooded with fraud.
Thank you both very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to pick up on the last discussion from my colleague from Florida. Is there any reason to think that stolen identity comments and rulemaking are limited to the FCC rulemaking?
No, there's not. The Wall Street Journal, in a substantial investigative piece about 1.5 years ago, identified similar problems before the Department of Labor, the CFPB, as well as the Securities and Exchange Commission, and there has been some evidence in the press of problems before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The Administrative Procedure Act is from 1946.
Sure.
It's aging. It's getting creaky. And in the digital age, we're going to have to figure out how to make sure that this channel for public comment in Washington is bolstered and more secure and more open to what people think so that we don't see this kind of identity theft and fraud going forward.
Well, that's what I'm talking about. We're talking about H.R. 1 going after cleaning up American democracy, but so many of the rules and regulations that we operate under here in America were formulated under the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act, and they depend for public comment on these nowadays on the internet for that. So that's a huge topic that we really need to wrap our arms around. I wanted to ask you, Commissioner Rosenworcel, about broadband internet for rural places. I represent a couple of wonderful counties in Pennsylvania, Wayne County and Pike County, and they're gorgeous places and places you want to spend a lot of time with your family at. But they don't have broadband internet anywhere. And, you think about what that means. It means, limited opportunities that people have to communicate with the outside world compared to every other place that has those things. It means limited opportunity for children to learn about the world through the internet. But maybe worst of all, it really hampers the ability of areas like this to attract outside businesses coming in. Because outside businesses, who can choose any place in the world to locate, probably aren't going to want to locate someplace where the families of the workers don't want to live there because they can't go online, unless it's like with one bar on their cell phone, which is what they get in Wayne County. 48 of the 67 counties in Pennsylvania are considered rural. There are 800,000 Pennsylvanians lacking access to high-speed internet, and 2/3 of them are in rural areas. I appreciate your comments, Commissioner Rosenworcel, about the need for better mapping, and I couldn't agree more. People in Wayne and Pike counties have told me it's a priority of theirs to get broadband internet access. But this points to the problem. Laying lines over vast amounts of territory, lots of land, with relatively few people. That's what rural territory is. It's just not a profitable proposition for private sector internet service providers. Last year, Congress made what some have called a down payment, quote unquote, on investing in rural infrastructure, broadband infrastructure, by creating the $600 million Reconnect program to be administered by the USDA Rural Utility Service. And an additional $550 million was added in the fiscal year 2019 omnibus. With all the work on broadband networks currently underway pursuant to FCC's universal service programs, how do we ensure that these additional infrastructure, broadband infrastructure resources are coordinated with other programs to prevent duplication of effort, Commissioner Rosenworcel?
Well, thank you for the question. You're absolutely right. The only way that we are going to get our bang for the buck is if we coordinate all of these federal programs. You know, it's a strange fact, but the Department of Agriculture, which received those funds, is up the street from the FCC. And yet I fear that we don't regularly have conversations about what they're doing and what we're doing. And if we want to maximize our scarce dollars, we need to do more of that.
Now, when it comes to helping fund broadband networks, how do we ensure that investments made leveraging federal resources won't be outdated and can actually deliver on the promises being made and the dollars being awarded?
Something that we're going to have to be mindful of. I can't speak specifically to the Department of Agricultural Rural Utility Services choices, but certainly the FCC makes choices about its Universal Service Fund. And for instance, right now mandates that those funds for broadband are generally used for 25 megabit service. The idea is not to fund service that is too slow and backward looking, but to try to fund services that are forward looking.
Well, I thank you to both of you for appearing today, and I yield back.
Mr. Graves?
Hey, Mr. Chairman, just maybe if you could just give us an update, Mr. Chairman. I know this committee appropriated $1 billion over 2 years to help with the TV relocating, the Broadcasters Relocation Fund. Can you just give us an update? How's it going? Are we on track, on schedule, and things going as you expected?
Appreciate the question, Congressman. We are on track so far. We completed phase 1 successfully. My recollection is that 193 stations transitioned during what was called phase 1. We're now in the midst of phase 2, which is scheduled to close soon, and we have already had 115 stations that have transitioned. In addition to that, we have taken the authority that you gave us, and we have started establishing a framework for identifying how protected stations, low-power TV, Translator, and FM radio stations can get reimbursement through the additional money that you allocated for this purpose. So we are, in addition to that, you also allocated money for consumer education. So we set up a call center dedicated to this purpose. We put out alerts in English and Spanish. We've additionally created some web content that people can access on our website if they have questions about rescanning and the like. So this is one of our top priorities. I said from my earliest days as a commissioner, we wanted to make sure that this transition was a smooth one. And thanks in part to the resources you've given us, I can report to you that as of today, that transition is in fact going well.
That's good. Well, I appreciate the entire commission's work on that. I know that's something the entire commission is very supportive of. From a reimbursable cost perspective, do you have a process in place to make sure that the proper expenses are being reimbursed? Can you help us understand that, how that works?
We do, and we don't want it to simply be a case of anyone can submit paperwork and we immediately send out a check without looking at it. There are certain categories of costs, some of which are reimbursable, some of which are not. At the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're able to report to you that we did not spend a single dollar in this process on something that more properly should have been the province of the broadcaster itself. But that core promise of the incentive auction, that we would transition broadcasters and hold them harmless, they wouldn't have to pay out of their own pocket for a relocation that was out of their control, that continues to be the case.
Great, thank you. Mr. Rosenworcel, how do you feel about the program? Going well? Anything else we could be doing?
I agree with the chairman. I think it's proceeding thoughtfully. It's a big task.
It is.
And we are still in early days, so I think it's incumbent on the agency that if we identify problems going forward, we come to you and try to identify how to fix them.
Well, thank you. And I just want to thank the commission. I know you have a lot of difficult tasks in front of you, and I know you do the best you can to work together to find solutions. And this was one in which I think everybody worked together to help help guide us with what was the proper steps to take. And even for us, authorizers and appropriators working together to get to the final product and end was very productive. So, but thanks again for joining us today, for your good work, and look forward to visiting with you again in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The issues under FCC's jurisdiction, from spectrum sharing to auction implementation to consumer protection, are becoming more and more complex each and every year. But it appears as if the administration is requesting less funding, particularly than we provided in 2019. Commissioner Rosenworcel, do you support the funding level for the commission? If not, where do you believe the commission needs additional resources?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I believe, considering that the FCC fully pays for itself through fees, this funding level is too low. We have the lowest level of employees in decades at a time when our services that we oversee are more important in every aspect of civic and commercial life. If we want to lead the world in 5G service, run multiple spectrum auctions, manage the scourge of robocalls, and deal with the growing set of cybersecurity issues, we're going to need more resources to do that well. And I think that this budget falls short.
You need more fees, or you need Congress to appropriate more
I think
funds?
we need more employees to carry out those important tasks.
So we need to fund that. Chairman Pye, do you believe that the requested funding provides adequate resources for the Commission to continue its ongoing and its planned work? We have concerns about the state of the Commission's information technology, particularly the systems that support auctions and licensing. Does the level of requested resources allow you to upgrade all of your critical systems?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. This level that we have submitted on behalf of the administration, $335 million, itself represents a $13 million bump from when I first got into office. And so we do recognize the additional resources Congress has given.
Is it enough?
So in that regard, to the extent that Congress seeks to allocate additional resources, I can assure you that we will use them wisely, in part to upgrade those legacy IT systems. That's one of the things we'd be happy to work with you on, Congressman. This number is, of course,
I'm asking you, do you want us to appropriate more than you ask for?
Congressman, should you see fit to give us the $339 million that you gave us in the previous year?
We can do this all day, gentlemen.
But I do want to, in all seriousness, I do want to assure you that whatever number you pick,
I want you to tell me, do you need more money?
We would not complain with the level of funding.
I didn't ask you whether you would complain. Just tell me, do you need more resources to do the job that you're asked to do, that you're required to do?
Congressman, I believe
effectively.
I believe we could discharge our core responsibilities with the number we submitted. However, to the extent that we went with the $339 million that we submitted to OMB, again, we could discharge additional responsibilities that we identified.
Thank you, Chairman. A key part of the FCC's analysis with regard to net neutrality was the claim that net neutrality harms investment. Yet the evidence supporting that's not clear. And ISP executives have said that net neutrality did not affect their business decisions. Commissioner Rosenworcel, during the rulemaking process, the chairman stated that he would only change his mind on net neutrality if presented with economic analysis that shows credibly that as infrastructure investment that has increased dramatically. In your opinion, is that position consistent with FCC's rulemaking requirements, and is that, in your opinion, good policy?
I think that the record reflects that capital expenditures have decreased since the FCC's net neutrality rules went in place at the major providers. But I would also argue that this is a subject that needs peer review. It's not something where we should simply accept data that's from the carriers themselves. We need to think thoughtfully about long-term infrastructure in this country, and not just broadband providers, but the greater digital ecosystem. I think the record reflects that net neutrality rules were no damper on investment, but I will respect the idea that we have to continue to watch this issue.
Chairman Powell, the FCC's order dedicated 18 paragraphs to discussing the impact of ISPs and only 2 to content and other edge providers. Why did you find that sufficient, given the enormous size and impact of the internet economy? This committee recently approved the creation of the new Office of Economics and Analytics. Will this allow the FCC to conduct independent economic analysis in cases where economic record is ambiguous, like with net neutrality?
Congressman, that's precisely the reason why we established this office, is to centralize that function of economists and data analysts and others who previously had been sprinkled throughout the administration, the agency, without any workflow participation necessarily. They were sometimes left out of the equation altogether. So we wanted to create a central office where they have a seat at the policy-making table to tell us, this is what the costs and benefits are. These are the gaps in the data sets that we've got. These are the things we're seeing in terms of geographic information mapping and the like. And that way, we can make better decision-making at the front end as opposed to the way it's been done historically.
Ms. Rosen-Worcel?
Well, we'll see if where timing is, sir, when we get done with this segment. Mr. Amade.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as I look around, probably as the oldest guy in the room, I'm not going to be talking 5G and 4 SSS, double reverse Johnson, and all that other sort of stuff. So if anybody thinks I'm trying to impersonate a tech person on communications, you are mistaken. With that said, first of all, I want to thank you both, because in the stuff that we've worked out on the Spectrum repack and all that other sort of stuff for TV stuff, through your chairmanship and the previous chairmanship, your staff has been very responsive. We want to talk to you about it, what's going on in my neck of the woods, that sort of stuff. And so I think regardless of where you think we ought to be or what, the agency has been phenomenally cooperative and a standout in my experience in 8 years here. You didn't always tell me what I liked, but you always responded and told the truth and did it in a timely manner and worked well. So I want to say thank you. Then the next thing I want to tell you is this. There are parts in northern Nevada, and if those people in Wayne County want to see rural, let me just tell you this. I'll show you rural, and we don't even have trees there. It's so rural. Obviously, he's doing some security stuff over there on his device right now, so we won't bother that because that's very important. But having said that, there are a few spots where when you talk about driving from Phoenix to Flagstaff in Arizona, it's like, I don't want you to do anything to change some of those spots in Nevada because people go there because there is no coverage. Okay? The final thing is this. I know we're talking about the coming, 5G and all that stuff, and that's where most of the future is in that. But in talking with broadcasters in my neck of the woods, some of that old technology is kind of the doomsday infrastructure, if you will. We spend a lot, as we should, to say we want these networks to be as bulletproof as possible and blah, 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 and fail-safe and all that. But at the end of the day, there's that old, I'm not going to say rabbit ear stuff because I know most people in here don't remember that. But having said that, it's like I would like to follow back up with your staff and say, so what are we doing for the doomsday infrastructure? Because it seems to me that this is such a lucrative target that there's always going to be people out there trying to defeat you, because online is such a rich place for wonderful things, but also for evil. And so you're going to deal with that, and I don't envy you a bit. But could you just briefly, it's like, is there any thought going on in all the stuff that's going on there to go, hey, wait a minute, if that goes down in that region because of whatever, we can still switch over to those folks that we took care of when we were repacking Spectrum and stuff like that, to where if we have to, it's like tune your radio to blah, blah, or turn on to the emergency broadcast network old style. Anybody looking at that?
Certainly we are, Congressman. We share that concern. For example, one of the things I do regularly is get briefed in our classified facility about some of the risks we're seeing to critical infrastructure and elsewhere. And I'm sure you get these briefings too. It's a danger given how open our society traditionally is and how reliant we are on some of those kinds of infrastructure. So the other thing we do is work regularly with federal partners. I personally worked, for example, with the head of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency over at DHS. We're coordinating now with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to make sure we're on the same page in terms of the energy grid. And this is a cross-cutting effort because all of these industries, from energy to healthcare, you name it, rely on technology at the end of the day. So we've got a seat at that table, I can assure you.
Well, if I might just briefly, and then Madam Commissioner, you can, but it's like, listen, especially when you add the rural element into it, when push comes to shove, sometimes it's the only thing is that old technology sitting on the mountaintop that gives you something. So that's why it's something that's kind of floating around in our thought process.
You know, when we have fires in Northern California and floods in Nebraska and Hurricane Sandy, we do have to remember that most people turn to their broadcasters to learn what's going on. And when the power goes out, your phones, they're hard to charge. We've got to be mindful that a radio with batteries, which feels awfully old school, may be one of the most important things we all have around. All right. I'll take old school. But I think we have to remind ourselves in this digital world that there are some analog technologies that can continue to help keep us safe, and we've got to make sure that our systems protect them.
Thank you both. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Amade mentions the rabbit ears. For those who don't remember, they were actually on top of your TV set when you had to walk over and turn the channel, and they were kind of a small antenna that you would move around. And the problem with it is that if once you touched them, you became part of the antenna, and you immediately got new reception. So being the youngest in the family, they would make me just sort of hold it until they could watch a decent TV show. I don't know how to follow with that, Mr. Cartwright, but it's up to you.
On behalf of the committee, may I thank the chairman for revealing what life in antiquity was like. Chairman Pai, you heard Commissioner Rosenworcel and I talking about mapping, and I wanted to give you a chance to weigh in. The shortcomings of current broadband mapping data are obvious. They're widely publicized and acknowledged. The Rural Utility Service employs a review process to help verify which areas are unserved and ensure that as she said, scarce resources, limited loan and grant dollars will go to where the need is greatest. The FCC has employed a similar process for certain USF mechanisms in the past, but not always. Chairman, do you agree that a challenge/evidentiary process is a good way to improve the accuracy of maps before funding decisions are made?
I couldn't agree more, Congressman, and that's why last year, 2 years ago rather, I set up, and my colleagues agreed with the challenge process that involved not just competitive providers, but opening up to others, farm bureaus, for example, legislators, and others who might want to challenge those maps. And in addition to that, we started an investigation into one or more of the carriers that we thought submitted inaccurate maps because we wanted to make sure they were submitting accurate data to us at the end of the day. And that's on the mobility side. On the fixed broadband side, I share your frustration coming from a rural part of the country myself, where it's hard to get coverage. One of the problems I encountered when I first got in office 2 years ago is the FCC's process for getting information from broadband providers was created in 2000. Now, just think about how long ago that was. 19 years is an eon in this era. And so we started a proceeding to upgrade that Form 477, as it's called, process. We've been meeting with stakeholders. We've been encouraging private sector actors to start mapping initiatives of their own. But the bottom line is we want to get better data in because that ensures, and we would be able to report to you, that every dollar going out in the Universal Service Fund is, in fact, closing that digital divide in Pike County or Parsons, Kansas, wherever it is.
How much are you, right now, are you relying on service, private sector service providers for giving you the information about where the areas are that are unserved?
That has traditionally been the process, that they submit this Form 477. 100%. A fair amount, yeah, except for the challenge process with respect to Mobility Fund, too.
So what else can be done to improve broadband coverage maps?
I think making sure the mapping process is robust. Congress obviously has allocated resources to the Commerce Department now, in part to address this issue. Continuing to work with non-traditional stakeholders, as I might call them, encouraging farmers and others to participate in that process, either through their farm bureaus or on their own. I mean, there are so many things that we're doing right now to upgrade the granularity and meaningfulness of that data we're getting in.
I'm glad you used that word, granularity. I am curious to learn more about the recent announcement that the FCC and internet service providers will work to develop a more granular broadband data and mapping approach Tell us more about that.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. We have encouraged some of the trade associations working on this issue to develop mapping initiatives, and some of them are starting to do that. I recently spoke at an event where one of those trade associations representing essentially phone companies announced an initiative to get that mapping initiative underway. Other providers and trade associations are doing that as well. But this issue is so important in terms of granularity. Last week, for example, I found myself on the Muller Ranch, which is in a rural part of Yolo County, California. They're not far from Sacramento, one of the biggest cities. But Frank Muller, who's the owner of the ranch, said, if you look at...
Different Muller.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Frank. Just if I,
all
in case
very
I did not
confused.
Did I say? I thought I said Frank, but in case I didn't. But one of the things he showed me was essentially this metal rod that he's been using, that his father might have used, his grandfather might have used to measure soil moisture. And he said, essentially, just take out a chunk of soil and feel it to feel how moist it is. Then he showed me this very advanced tool. And he said, all I have to do is stick this thing in there, and it monitors soil moisture and pH and nitrogen and all the rest of it, but I can't use it because it relies on 4G LTE. And if you look at it on a map, you would think, oh, he's near Sacramento. He's a big city guy. Just a few miles away from Sacramento, he's essentially in another geographic zone. And so we wanted to change that to make it more granular so we understand the Muller ranches that are out there and target our funding to people like him and to places like his, so that they can get on the grid.
And working with the trade associations, as you mentioned, it sounded like you're encouraging them to do that. Is that correct?
Absolutely. This is an all-hands-on-deck effort. We want all of them to be foremost thinking about how to give the FCC, the American public...
Not to interrupt, but I'm almost out of time. You're encouraging them, but you're not requiring them. Is that it?
Well, we do require them to participate in our Form 477 process, in the Mobility Fund mapping data collection initiative that we've got. Those are mandatory efforts, but we also want to encourage them to think about developing tools as well, because ultimately it's beneficial not just to us, but to consumers to understand where broadband is and where it isn't.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Chairman, Commissioner, I'll say this. I think the ranking member will join me. We may agree, we may disagree. You two may agree and disagree, but I will say you two are very well prepared and forthcoming, and we appreciate your participation and your service, and this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, sir.
I think they gave me the word.
Okay, all right.
No, that's okay. Good to see you. The driver likes it.
Yes.
Oh, my God.
All right.
Hey, Chairman. Thank you so much.
Look forward to working with you guys on that.
Exchange means
Everything they want.
Yeah, not too many, since we only get